There is a paradox that keeps many people trapped after betrayal without ever understanding it. The person who betrayed you while you loved them sincerely is often the very person who begins to revalue you only after you leave completely. This not only hurts, it scrambles your perception. Because if they could see your worth after everything, why couldn't they see it when you were still there, loyal, patient, and fighting to hold the relationship together at any cost? Most people try to explain this paradox through emotion. They believe it's regret, realization, delayed love, a life lesson. But that explanation keeps them stuck because it places the emphasis in the wrong place. In the psychological structure of a narcissist, betrayal and revaluation are not opposites. They are not located at two ends of different feelings. They are two links in the same operating cycle, activated by the same core drivers: control, the avoidance of shame, and the maintenance of an ego that refuses to face itself. Betrayal doesn't happen because you lack value. It happens when your value starts to become too real, too stable, too intimate, and therefore becomes a threat. When you love deeply, stay long, and don't leave even when you're hurt, you stop being merely an emotional supply. You become a mirror. And that mirror reflects what the narcissist cannot tolerate: their unconscious dependency, the emptiness inside, and the fear of being seen as not enough. At that point, betrayal is not a moral choice. It is a psychological survival reflex. It helps them rupture a bond that is becoming dangerous to their ego. But betrayal doesn't stand alone. It is followed by devaluation, then discard steps they need in order to convince themselves that they are right, that you are the problem, that your departure or their pushing you out is justified. In this phase, they feel relief. They believe they've escaped. They believe you can be replaced. And as long as you still react, still explain, still hurt, that system keeps running smoothly. They haven't lost anything. Only when absence appears, not a breakup on paper, but a real absence at the psychological level, does the cycle begin to malfunction. When you no longer react, no longer return to your old role, no longer play the one who maintains the connection at any cost, the narcissist doesn't just lose you, they lose the structure that helped them define themselves. And that is the point at which revaluation emerges, not as a romantic awakening, but as a delayed response to the loss of control. They start to see your value, not because you changed, but because you are no longer there to be treated as expendable. This video is not created to help you be revalued, nor does it encourage you to wait for a turning back. On the contrary, it is built to break the most dangerous illusion of all, that revaluation is something worth wanting. We will walk through the full sequence: betrayal, devalue, discard, absence, revalue, not through surface emotion, but through the logic of depth, psychology, so you can understand why betrayal is a beginning rather than an ending, why silence is the real severing blow, and why, when they finally start to see your value, you are no longer standing in the old position. This is not a story about what they realize. It is a story about the moment you withdraw from a system that was never built to love. Part 1. Betrayal. Not a mistake, but a survival reflex. Betrayal in a relationship with a narcissist is rarely a sudden outburst or an impulsive decision. It does not begin with desire for someone else, nor does it begin because you were not good enough. It begins much earlier, quietly, at the moment the relationship shifts from initial stimulation to real attachment. When emotions are no longer a game, when your presence becomes stable, when you stay not because they are perfect, but because you have chosen them, something dangerous starts to happen inside the narcissist. They lose control over their own emotional state. In the early stage, narcissists are often highly charming, deeply invested, and very present. Not because they love in a mature sense, but because that phase allows them to remain in control. You are drawn in, you open up, and you reflect back to them the feeling of being special, admired, and needed. But when the relationship moves to a deeper level, one that requires consistency, emotional responsibility, and the capacity to stay, the narcissist's internal structure begins to destabilize. For them, intimacy does not equal safety. Intimacy means being seen, and being seen is something they learn to avoid very early in life. When you love them sincerely, you don't just offer emotion. You unknowingly place a mirror in front of them. You see their vulnerabilities, their insecurities, the inner gaps they themselves do not want to face. You love even those parts. But to a narcissist, being seen and still having someone stay does not feel like love. It feels like exposure. And when the ego cannot tolerate exposure, it will try to rupture the bond before it is forced to mature. Betrayal becomes the most effective tool for that rupture. It creates immediate distance. It restores a sense of power. It allows the narcissist to retreat from an unconscious dependency they cannot admit to themselves. By betraying, they are not only breaking the relationship, they are breaking the intimacy that threatens their defensive system. This is not an action against you. It is an action against the experience of being too closely attached. One crucial point many people miss. Narcissists often betray the person they are most bonded to, not the one they devalue or dismiss. Superficial, low-depth relationships rarely trigger serious betrayal. Only when you are close enough, long enough, and real enough does betrayal become necessary. At that point, you are no longer an easily controlled source of supply. You are a threat to their internal avoidance structure. Betrayal also allows the narcissist to rewrite the story in their favor. It creates a reason for them to convince themselves that the relationship was wrong, that you were too much, too complex, too emotional. But look closely. That story appears after the betrayal, not before it. They betray first, and only then do they need a narrative to survive what they have done. This reveals that betrayal is not the result of your flaws, but the result of their inability to remain inside a real relationship. So if there is one thing that must be clearly understood at this first stage, it is this. Betrayal says nothing about your worth. It speaks to their limits. It is the reflex of a nervous system that cannot tolerate prolonged intimacy, and of an ego that feels safe only when there is always an exit. And it is from this betrayal that the next phase of the cycle begins, devaluation, where they must diminish you in order to avoid facing the truth that they have destroyed a meaningful connection with their own hands. Part 2. Devalue, diminishing you so they don't have to face themselves. After betrayal, the narcissist cannot stop there. Betrayal is only the opening move. To survive psychologically, they are compelled to enter the next phase, devaluation. This is not a natural emotional shift, but a compulsory defense mechanism. If they do not diminish you, they would have to face what their ego cannot tolerate: guilt, shame, and the awareness that they themselves destroyed a meaningful relationship. Devaluation is how the narcissist converts shame into power. Instead of feeling that they did something wrong, they need to believe that you are the problem. As a result, your image begins to be distorted. The very qualities once seen as good sensitivity, care, patience, the desire for connection are now labeled as weakness, neediness, burden, too much. What must be clearly seen is this. These labels do not appear when you first loved each other. They only emerge after the betrayal. They are not the cause, but the tools used to legitimize their behavior. At this stage, the narcissist needs to reconstruct a narrative strong enough to allow them to keep functioning without collapsing. In that story, they are not the one who caused destruction, but someone trapped in an incompatible relationship. You are pushed into the role of being too emotional, too dependent, too hard to please. This narrative is not only told to others, but more importantly, repeated within their own inner world. Each repetition further numbs their capacity to feel the truth. Devaluation also serves another function. extinguishing whatever attachment remains. Even though the narcissist does not love in a healthy way, there were still moments of genuine connection with you. But that connection has now become dangerous because it could lead them back to shame and loss of control. By focusing on your flaws, magnifying conflicts, and reinterpreting the past through a negative lens, they anesthetize their own latent pain. The more you are diminished, the safer they feel. What makes devaluation especially cruel is that it often occurs while you are still loving, still trying to understand, still seeking repair. Your confusion, why did they change so suddenly, is precisely the sign that devaluation is at work. You did not suddenly change. It is simply that their system needs you to become bad, so they do not have to become bad in their own story. At this stage, the narcissist often says or thinks things like, "We were never really compatible. This relationship was too heavy. They made me lose myself." These statements can sound reasonable, but look deeper. If the relationship were truly wrong, they would not have needed betrayal to escape it. Devaluation exists because the truth is far more complex, and they lack the capacity to remain with that complexity. For you, devaluation is the phase most likely to destabilize your self-perception. You begin to wonder whether you really were too much, too sensitive, too demanding. But what must be stated clearly is this: devaluation does not reflect who you are. It reflects how much they need to distort reality in order to protect their ego. And once devaluation has completed its function, once you have been positioned as the problem, the narcissist can move on to the next stage of the cycle: discard, where they formally remove you in order to seal the story in their favor. Part 3. Discard. Removal as a way to lock control over the narrative. Once devaluation has completed its task, the narcissist enters the discard phase not with a sense of loss, but with the feeling that the stage has been fully set. At this point, removing you is no longer an emotional act, it is a strategic move. Discard allows them to finalize the entire story in their favor. They are the one who left because it was incompatible, while you are the one left behind for being too much, too heavy, too complicated. More importantly, discard enables them to freeze any possibility of being questioned. When you are no longer there, you are no longer someone who can challenge the version of reality they are constructing. During this phase, the narcissist often appears decisive, cold, even cruel. Not because they have no emotions left, but because emotion is something they cannot afford to touch at this moment. Any hesitation could pull them back into the shame that devaluation only temporarily covered. So they need to leave quickly, cleanly, and forcefully enough that they do not have to look back. Discard is how they convince themselves that they are in control, that they are the one initiating, that they have lost nothing. One crucial point must be understood. Discard is not meant to end the relationship in a healthy sense. It is meant to end your role in their emotional regulation system. Before this, even while being devalued, you were still within their orbit. You were still reacting, still hurting, still trying to understand. Discard severs that role abruptly so they can exit the relationship with a feeling of having won. This is why discard is often accompanied by silence, disappearance, or a cold final statement that gives you no room to speak further. At the discard stage, the narcissist often experiences a form of false relief. The pressure of intimacy has been lifted. There is no longer anyone reflecting their insecurity back to them, no one asking difficult questions. On a biological level, this is when their nervous system temporarily calms down. They may appear fine, even as if they are doing better. But this relief does not come from healing, it comes from successful avoidance. It lasts only as long as they believe you are still within reach, that if needed, they could come back, or that you are still somewhere waiting. Discard is also the phase in which the narcissist often moves quickly to someone else, or constructs the image of a new life. This is not because they have truly moved on, but because they need a new source of validation to reinforce the old story. A new person, a new setting, a new role, all of these help them avoid returning to the void that has just been created. What they fail to realize is this: discard removes you from the surface of their life, but it does nothing to resolve the core problem within. And it is precisely here that something crucial begins to form. Discard only works as long as you are still reacting, whether through pain, anger, or attempts to hold on. If you disappear for real, if you no longer participate in the story they are telling, discard loses its stabilizing function, because discard was never designed to withstand prolonged absence. It was designed to end a relationship, not to face absence, the next phase, where your silence begins to expose the first cracks in the narcissist's entire structure of control. Part 4. Absence. When silence begins to break the system. Absence is not a breakup. It is also not a temporary period of no contact. Absence is the moment you withdraw from the narcissist's entire emotional regulation system, leaving no reaction, no explanation, no argument, no presence in any form that they can reach. For this very reason, absence is the first stage in the cycle that the narcissist cannot control. They can initiate betrayal, they can devalue, they can discard. But they cannot command you to disappear in a way that destabilizes their structure. What must be understood is that narcissists operate on a system of prediction. They are accustomed to knowing how you will react. You will hurt, you will question, you will try to understand, you will attempt to reconnect. The entire previous cycle, from betrayal to discard, is built on the assumption that you are still there in some role. When absence occurs, that assumption collapses. You are no longer in the position of the one left behind, nor are you in the position of a replaceable supply. You simply stop participating. This silence creates a critical error in the narcissist's psychological system. They do not only lose access to you, they lose the mirror that once helped them define who they were in that relationship. Without your reflection, their self-image begins to blur. The narratives they constructed after devaluation and discard no longer have a listener, no longer have confirmation. And when a story no longer has an audience, it begins to fracture. During the absence stage, the narcissist often experiences a vague form of instability. It does not immediately explode into pain or remorse. Instead, it appears as a sense of dissonance, irritation, restlessness, emptiness without a clear name. They may try to fill this gap with busyness, with a new person, with distraction, but your silence remains like a void that cannot be filled by external noise. Because what they have lost is not just a person, but a psychological function. Absence is also when the narcissist begins to monitor you discreetly, not because they miss you, but because they need to confirm that you are still within reach if necessary. They want to know whether you are hurting, whether you are standing still, whether you are waiting. Any sign that you are still affected helps temporarily stabilize their ego. But if they find nothing, no reaction, no information, no signal, the anxiety intensifies. At that point, silence is no longer neutral absence. It becomes an implicit message. You are no longer in the old position. The most important aspect of the absence stage is this. For the first time in the entire cycle, the narcissist loses control over the emotional rhythm. They do not know what is happening inside you. They do not know where they stand in your inner world. And this not knowing erodes the foundation of power they have relied on since the beginning of the relationship. Absence does not cause immediate collapse, but it creates an irreversible crack. From here, the system begins to slide into a void where old mechanisms no longer function, and where the next phase, revaluation, will not appear as a free choice, but as a compelled response to an increasingly evident loss of control. Part 5. Revalue. When they no longer see you through power, but through absence. Revaluation does not begin with love returning. It begins with a prolonged void that exceeds their capacity to control. After absence, the narcissist gradually realizes something unsettling. You do not come back to prove them right, nor do you stay to prove their importance. You exit their emotional orbit in a way that cannot be negotiated. And it is precisely at this point that your value begins to be restructured in their mind, not because you changed, but because they no longer have the ability to regulate you as before. Throughout the earlier stages, your image was defined by position. When you loved, you were taken for granted. When you hurt, you were seen as weak. When you stayed, you were seen as exploitable. But when absence extends over time, that entire reference system loses its function. The narcissist no longer has new data to continue devaluing you, no reactions to bend, no emotions to manipulate, no role to maintain. In this void, their mind is forced to turn backward toward memory, and memory, at this stage, is no longer distorted by the immediate need for control. Revaluation, therefore, unfolds quietly, without drama. It does not appear as a clear "I miss you," but takes shape through unconscious comparisons. The new person does not evoke the same feeling, current interactions lack depth, the stability that was once dismissed now appears rare. The paradox is that only when you are no longer there do they feel safe enough to see you as a whole human being rather than an emotional threat. At this stage, the narcissist begins to rewrite the story about you, but in the opposite direction of devaluation. What was once labeled too much becomes deep. Dependent is reinterpreted as attached. Weak is relabeled as genuine. However, this is not a moral awakening. It is a cognitive adjustment meant to reduce the sense of loss and shame that emerges when they realize they have lost a source of value that is not easily replaced. You also begin to be idealized in a way that feels safe for them, placed in the past at a distance, without demands, without challenge, without the need for connection. In that space, they can miss you without facing responsibility. This is why revaluation does not mean a desire to return to a healthy relationship, but rather a desire to restore a lost sense of control in a lower risk form. As a result, at this stage, the narcissist often hesitates between two options. The first is hoovering, attempting to reapproach you to test whether the old power still works. The second, when they are not yet confident enough to face you directly, is silent monitoring, watching you from a distance, gauging your emotional state, measuring your level of independence, and assessing whether you can still be pulled back into the old orbit. It is precisely this hesitation that opens the next phase of the cycle, where approach is no longer impulsive, but becomes a calculated move. Part 6. Hoovering. When they try to pull you back without facing the truth, hoovering does not appear because love has suddenly awakened. It appears when revaluation collides with the fear of losing power. After absence and revalue, the narcissist enters a liminal state. They see your value more clearly, yet at the same time realize you are no longer in the old position that allowed easy manipulation. Hoovering, therefore, is not an impulsive act, but a series of strategies designed to test boundaries, to determine whether you still react, still leave the door open, still can be pulled back. The first move is often vague hoovering. No apology, no reference to the past, no declarations of love or longing. Just a seemingly harmless message, an unfocused question, a coincidental reason to reach out, asking about work, mentioning a small shared memory, sending a song, an emoji, a line like, "I suddenly thought of you." The goal is not connection, but measurement. If you reply quickly, explain a lot, or respond warmly, they know the door is not fully closed. When vague hoovering is not strong enough, they shift to emotional hoovering. The tone changes. They speak about exhaustion, loneliness, difficulty, even crisis, not to take responsibility, but to activate your old role, the one who understands, the rescuer, the person who reads them better than anyone else. They do not say, "I hurt you." They say, "I'm not doing well." The focus remains on them. Your pain stays outside the frame. Another tactic is nostalgic hoovering. They bring up the most beautiful version of the relationship, usually the beginning, trips, intimate moments, promises that were never fulfilled. Memory is carefully curated, stripped of betrayal, devaluation, and discard. The aim is to blur your present boundaries with the feeling that we were once special, causing you to question your decision to leave. When softer tactics fail, the narcissist may escalate to ego-targeting hoovering. They praise you, elevate you, acknowledge that you are different, special, unlike anyone else. But this recognition is not paired with behavioral change or accountability. It is simply a way to reactivate the idea that your value is still tied to their gaze. If you accept it, they know the power to define your worth remains with them. Another subtle form is indirect hoovering. They do not contact you directly, but through mutual friends, social media, or accidental signals appearing around your life. They let you happen to see that they miss you, are sad about you, or are doing better without you. All of this is meant to provoke an internal reaction, curiosity, comparison, doubt, so that even without direct contact, they can re-enter your psychological space. At times, hoovering takes on a victimized tone. They retell the story in a way that makes you feel you misunderstood them, that they were also hurt, that things were more complicated than you thought. This is how they avoid responsibility, by pulling you into a new dialogue where truth is blurred and boundaries are renegotiated. What all hoovering has in common is this: there is no clear accountability, no specific apology, no structural change, no different plan. Hoovering has only one purpose: to see whether you still react. If you do, they regain a sense of control and often withdraw again. If you do not, or respond in a very neutral way, they are forced to face a more unsettling truth: you have truly left. And it is here that hoovering becomes a critical turning point. Either they escalate further, becoming riskier and more explicit, or they retreat into silence, carrying obsession and distant monitoring with them. Whichever path they take, hoovering marks the moment when the narcissist is no longer acting from certainty, but from lack and insecurity. And that is the direct precondition for the final stage, where power no longer belongs to the one trying to come back, but to the one who no longer needs to turn around. Part 7. Inner collapse, when all strategies no longer work. This stage does not arrive immediately, and not every narcissist reaches it. It emerges only when hoovering fails, when every door they were once accustomed to opening closes in silence. There are no reactions, no emotions, no data left to manipulate. At this point, the narcissist does not only lose you, they lose the role they themselves played in a relationship that once defined their ego. Throughout the earlier cycle, they operated outwardly, betraying to seek new supply, devaluing to diminish you, discarding to reclaim power, revaluing to adjust perception, hoovering to test boundaries. But when all of these strategies no longer generate feedback, the defensive system begins to collapse from within. There is no one left to blame, no one left to activate, no one left to serve as a buffer for the inner voids that were never healed. This collapse usually unfolds in silence. There is no drama, no public display. Externally, they may still appear stable, even successful. Internally, however, a process of self-fracturing is underway. A narcissist can exist only as long as there is someone to reflect them. When that mirror disappears, they are forced to look directly at themselves, and that is what they have avoided their entire life. At this stage, the questions begin to shift. No longer, "Why did you leave?" or "How can I pull you back?" but rather, "What is it in me that makes everything always end this way?" This is the moment the ego is most severely threatened. Some encounter a profound sense of emptiness, a feeling of having no core, no stable identity, without someone else present to define who they are. Responses to this state tend to split into two paths. The first is defensive collapse. They experience anxiety, insomnia, mild depression, a sense of meaninglessness, not because they lost you, but because for the first time they cannot escape themselves. If there is enough awareness and enough pain, this rare point can lead to genuine self-questioning, even to seeking therapy. But this possibility is slim. The second path, far more common, is emotional freezing. Instead of facing the truth, they numb out. They accept living with a stable level of emptiness, replacing depth with distraction, connection with busyness, emotion with control. You become a memory that cannot be touched, both precious and dangerous. They carry you as a silent scar, neither healed nor forgotten. What must be clearly understood is this. At this stage, power has fully reversed. Not because of anything you did, but because of what you no longer do. You do not need to prove anything, to win, or to play the role of awakening them. Their collapse is not your victory. It is the natural consequence of a structure that existed on the reactions of others losing its source of nourishment. And it is here that the cycle ends, not with an apology, not with a return, but with a quiet truth. Some people only recognize the value of connection when it is gone, and some relationships truly end only when one person has completely stepped out of a role they were never meant to play. Part 8. Post-collapse. When you are no longer a character in their world, at this point, we are no longer speaking about the narcissist, though they remain there, quietly carrying the consequences of their own structure. This section is about the final state of the cycle. The moment you have fully withdrawn from the role that once kept the entire system running. There are no reactions left to trigger, no emotions left to regulate, no story left to rewrite. You do not disappear from their memory, but you disappear from their power. After the inner collapse takes place, the narcissist enters a new mode of existence without a mirror. They may continue living, continue forming surface-level connections, continue constructing an image, but beneath it all, something has permanently shifted. They know that there was once someone who saw them more clearly than anyone else, and that person left without needing an explanation. This truth is not loud, but it sits there as a blind spot that cannot be erased. For you, this is not a victory. It is a release from a role. You no longer need them to realize anything, regret anything, or return in any form. You are no longer standing inside the cycle, waiting for a better ending. Because you understand that the real ending does not lie in their reaction, but in your non-participation. When you no longer participate, you are no longer defined by what happened. At this stage, many people mistake the quiet for emptiness. But in reality, it is the space of sovereignty. For the first time, your emotions do not revolve around reading someone else's mind. For the first time, your energy is not pulled toward an external center. For the first time, you exist without needing to prove that you love enough, endure enough, understand enough, or sacrifice enough. You simply exist, and that is enough. The narcissist may still observe from a distance. They may still think of you as a standard no one else reaches. They may carry a vague, unnamed sense of regret. But none of that has any bearing on your direction. You are no longer their lesson, and they are no longer your test. The cycle ends not because they change, but because you stop orbiting them. The 7-stage sequence of the narcissist's inner collapse is neither a sentence nor a story meant to satisfy a sense of justice. It is simply the natural consequence of a structure that exists by feeding on the emotional participation of others, having its source of nourishment withdrawn. A narcissist does not collapse because you are stronger than they are, but because you are no longer there to keep that system functioning. The most important thing to understand is this. Their collapse is not your victory. If you still need them to realize something, still need their remorse, still need them to return to validate your worth, then you are still inside the cycle. True freedom begins when this story is no longer the center of your inner world. At that point, betrayal, devaluation, discard, or revaluation become concepts you understand, not wounds that continue to control you. The silence you hold is not punishment. It is the final boundary. It says that you no longer accept having to trade yourself in order to be loved, no longer repair what you did not break, no longer remain in systems that survive only through one-sided sacrifice. Silence, in this case, is not the absence of connection. It is reconnection with yourself. The narcissist may continue living with the consequences of their choices. They may carry the memory of you as a standard, as something lost, or as a scar that never fully heals. But that is their path. Your path begins the moment you stop being a mirror for someone else to look into and become the person who sees yourself most clearly. And if there is one final truth to hold on to, it is this: you did not leave so that they would realize anything. You left so that you would no longer have to disappear within that relationship. When you step out of the old role, the cycle closes not with a loud ending, but with a peace deep enough that it no longer needs explanation.